welcome along to today's webinar, which is all about how the FUG we address toxic teams and people around things. We're sharing this webinar because a lot of times we get invited by clients to get involved at the point that things have really broken down, whether that's with an individual or within a team. Lines have been drawn, all kind of sense of humanity and sensibility has disappeared on things. People are struggling to kind of see each other as the human beings that they are, and it becomes this kind of entrenched camps that are really, really difficult to engage and move through. So we thought that this would be a good session to share, because I know how stuck it can feel to be in that context, and I think it's particularly hard for us as HR professionals or leaders when we are asked to kind of get involved in that at the last minute, when it's really hit the sticky situation. So I'm just going to talk to you a bit about how we work this through. For those of you who don't know me or us, we are the Employee Experience Project. I'm Paula Brockwell, I'm the lead psychologist and founder. And our whole ethos as a business is about supporting other businesses to build great cultures. And we do have an absolute focus on supporting business performance and prospering, because that's why businesses are around, aren't they, to deliver their ultimate goal. But our ethos is very much around making sure that we create an environment where people can do that in a sustainably high performance based way. So supporting them to thrive within that context and drive things through. So my background is I'm an occupational psychologist. I've been doing this for more years than I like to admit these days. I've decided I'm going to stop counting at 20, because that's enough, isn't it, to sound like you've been doing it for a while. But you don't have to admit any more on that. Maybe I started when I was 16 and I'm 36. I didn't, but you know, let's stick with that, shall we? So been doing this a long time, and I think I've taken my own really personal journey on this, you know, working in the early stages and into the mid stages of my career in bigger consultancies, doing a lot of that very traditional kind of vision, value, culture cascade on things, and just seeing that it was really hard to get that stuff to take fire. It works well, I think, in culture kind of capture and cultivation stages where businesses are pretty much doing okay and they can work through functionally as they are. But whenever I set up the Employee Experience Project, I wanted to work on the stickier side of culture, the places where it's really hard for things to move. So we take a much more kind of positive psychology, mass behavior change approach on this to really make sure that we can understand how you capture people's hearts and minds and move them forward. So today we're going to take that ethos and all that kind of research and experience to think about this idea of toxic teams, and really thinking, you know, what are we experiencing and how do we address that? So I'm just going to open up a question to you before we get into things really. I would really love to hear the types of toxicity you have encountered through your career. So in responding to me, you're not saying it's happening in your current organisation, I promise. You can just tell me what sorts of things you've seen. If you want to pop it into the chat or you want to have a conversation with me, I don't mind, but I'm really interested in what types of toxicity you've experienced that have brought you, have made you curious about the content of today. Thanks, Martin. I saw bullying there. Yeah. Anything else? Sexual harassment? Yeah. I bet you everybody's sick of hearing about Greg Wallace at the moment, eh? Passive aggressiveness, isolating staff. Yeah. Yeah. Blame culture. I'm the boss mentality. Lovely. Yeah. Undermining people. Yeah. Overcompensation for the lack of knowledge. Yeah. Get that. Oh, there's nothing like that. Is that their joy? Whenever somebody gives you the answers to something they've got nothing really informed about. That's one of my favourites. I had a boss like that as well for a while. It's hard work, isn't it? Micromanagement, divisiveness, exclusion from conversations. Yes, absolutely. So pretty difficult behaviours, aren't they, to kind of work through on things. I'd be interested then to talk to you a little bit about, just so I understand kind of what world we're operating within, how do you typically intervene, or how are you asked to intervene? I guess I'm interested in what the norm has been within your career and your experiences in terms of, are you asked to help early whenever behaviours are starting to emerge or tension is emerging, or are you getting that last minute dash that I'm assuming most people experience? That's certainly when we get pulled in on things, but I'm interested in what your experience is in terms of the point at which you get pulled in on things. Lastminute.com. Yeah, absolutely. When it's blown up, when the SH1Ts hit the fan. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Oh gosh. Just part and parcel, eh, Aurora? That makes sense. Cool. Yeah, I think there is this instinct, isn't there? I think things, particularly I think with some of the behaviors that you're talking about, it can feel like such micro behaviors that people struggle to be able to confront them really, because it feels like lots of little things, or it feels quite soft and often immeasurable really in terms of how to talk about it. So often people wait, don't they, until it's really really difficult, or they have what I notice a lot is that a lot of managers will have intention based conversations, so they'll just ask people to be different without really talking about, well, how are you going to be different, and when are you going to be different, and how are we going to measure that and monitor it over time, which again allows it just to kind of fester and work through. Okay, so that makes sense. That's helpful to understand. We're all kind of in the same place in terms of the types of challenges that we're looking to resolve today, and the point at which we often get involved in them. So I think before we rush into the solutions, often what I find helpful to do is actually have a bit of a conversation about why people behave as they do. So just going back first of all to giving a bit of kind of clarity about why people who are often really decent on a one-to-one level, or decent with other people, or their families love them, don't they, so they must be all right some of the times on things, can display such really unhelpful behavior within a work context, either with a particular group or just within that particular context. So there's two things that I wanted to talk to you about with this. The first is, why do people behave as that? Well, really, it comes down to two things. Human behavior is driven typically by one of two things. There is either a need that needs to be fulfilled for individuals. So I think to somebody, the point where, a manager who's got to speak up and always be right on something, there's an ego need there for them, isn't there? There's something that they're trying to fulfill within themselves that has got nothing to do really with the situation or the interaction, but there is a need within them individually that they are trying to be able to fulfill that will impact them. So understanding if somebody's behaving in an unreasonable way, we want to understand, either is there something that is driving them, that is either a personal or an environmental need that they want to have met, or there is some sort of payoff to that behavior. So I was just confessing to Cara ahead of the session today that my 5-year-old is experimenting with full-on 5-year-old sized temper tantrums at the moment, and we've gone through it a couple of times. He did it for a few weeks in the terrible twos, and did it again in the teenager years. And what we're doing as a family, I guess, is having the conversations. Two psychologists as parents, of course, we're having the conversations about, is there a need here? What is going on? Why is this happening? Is it just that he's observed this behaviour somewhere else and he's experimenting with it? Oh, God bless you, Nicola. I'm glad we're in it together. Maybe we need a therapy session afterwards. But I think, is there a need there that we're not meeting? Is there something going on with school, etc., or something that we're just not aware of in the way that life is busy around Christmas, that we're not meeting a need, or we need to explore that further? Or is there something in the way that we're responding that he's experimented with that behaviour and he's got some sort of payoff from it that was helpful within that context, or has reinforced that behaviour? And human behaviour doesn't really change from that 5-year-old stage to the 35 or the 55 or the 65-year-old stage. We are still driven by those same needs. So at a very base psychological level, we want to feel safe, we want to feel valued, and we want to feel kind of seen and heard around things. So sometimes toxicity can be because the organizational environment or the team environment is creating some sort of threat for individuals, or they are just carrying some sort of threat into the context that they're trying to get the need met around. So some of it might be historical, it might be about their own development, etc. But there's also something about, actually, is there anything in the environment here that's triggering this person? And I think the world of work demands a lot from people at the moment. You see a lot of what's happening in some of the bigger organizations in particular, where they're demanding a lot of immersion, flexibility, engagement, always on, and a huge about more work and complexity of work. But they've asked everybody to come back into the office 3 or 5 days a week, and that wasn't what the deal was previously. And that's creating, for example, pressure for people in terms of their own contract about what they expected in terms of the time they would spend with their family within that role, practicalities around that, cost of travel, etc., that could be actually really triggering people in a way that the organization isn't really considering. It's thinking about its own needs. And I think there's this interesting thing that certainly we're seeing happening at the moment, where I think COVID went to a place of being really very colleague centric. We all looked after colleagues, we did what we could to keep people safe, we had lots of connection points and support, and put colleague experience very to the fore. And I think that reset the psychological contract for a lot of people around, I need my organisation to make me feel special, to make me feel safe, etc. And there's this resetting that's happening at the moment. Some organisations are going a bit too far in terms of business needs now, but even for those who are trying to calibrate that to the balance between business and individual needs, there is some discomfort, I think, for colleagues in terms of not feeling that their needs are met. So this piece, I think, is a really interesting one to explore in terms of what's actually going on here. The first question for me is always, is there a need? Is there something that we need to understand? Is there some give and take that we need to look at here, rather than just asking this person to give and give and give and comply in a situation that doesn't feel healthy or safe for them? But also looking at the ecosystem around them. Are they getting some payoff on this? So is their manager scared of conflict? So if they flare up and they use either passive aggression or direct aggression on something, has their manager over the last 6 or 12 or 18 months given them what they want? So it's taught them actually that behaviour is A, acceptable, and B, useful in terms of driving their influence around what they need around things. Are there colleagues within their world that are encouraging and celebrating that behaviour? Have they got into a tribe that is making that feel like it's all right to be disapproved by other people because it works within this context and it's making me look like the big kid around things? So understanding what actually is driving that dynamic is helpful, because if we just have intent-based conversations, or we're just telling people that they need to be different, but they're still caught in a system where their needs haven't been met or the payoff is still happening, there is no incentive for them to change, really. So we need to make sure that we're helping them meet their need, or understand that that need is not an appropriate one for them to try and meet in a work context, or we need to remove the payoff. Does that make sense to people? Yeah. So far, so ethereal, potentially. So I think it's a useful thing, though, to think about in the context of what we're going to talk about in a little while. I think the other psychological concept that I wanted to talk to you about, just for a bit of a background on this, and something that I use to make sense of some of this behaviour, is, has anybody come across this idea of an extinction burst before? You can give me a yes or a no in the chat, or just give me a wave if you're still on camera. No. Okay, Grant, let me talk. There's enough no's there that I'm going deep. Okay, I'm going to tell you about this then. Okay, so the idea of an extinction burst then is recognizing again that this idea that human behavior is designed to get some sort of outcome. We are efficiency based, safety based, and experimental creatures. So the way that we develop the behavior that we use on a day-to-day basis goes right back to our evolutionary roots, really. So if you think when we were out hunter gathering, efficiency was really important. So we would try a behavior. So I'll go to the gathering side of things rather than the hunting side of things. But if we knew, for example, that there was a particular area of our territory that had really good berries on it, we were very unlikely as a species to go roaming and have lots of adventures on that. We would keep going back to that bush. And the only thing that would change our behaviour actually was kind of whether that bush ran out of berries consistently and we needed to go somewhere else. If we went for a wander looking for some more berries and we ended up in a barren cave that looked like nothing was ever going to grow in there, we'd probably never go back to that cave again, because we teached ourselves that there was no point expending resources in a place where we were unlikely to get a significant payoff. And we might miss, I don't know, we might miss a big saber-toothed tiger that's sleeping in there that we could have hunted and worked through. But there's a thing that happens then, that if we get a payoff on a behaviour, we reinforce that and we do it again, because it supports our survival, it supports our capacity to work efficiently, because that worked in the past, so it's more likely to work in the future. And so how an extinction burst works is if we've got a behaviour that we've got evidence and we've kind of coded into our brain is a behaviour that works, if it suddenly stops working, what we do is just try and do a bit more of that behavior. So we just try and do it a bit more extreme, a bit faster, just to test it out to see, because all of our evidence tells us that that thing works and that keeps us safe or helps us to survive. So typically, whenever you put a barrier in front of someone or you remove the system around them that's been giving that payoff and that kind of functionality of that behavior, even if it's unacceptable, it's still been functional on a level. What they'll do is try that behavior again, and their brain is trying to figure out why that route isn't working. And before it gives up on it, it'll escalate a few times. So I'm sorry, I'm going to take you back into the kids analogy on this. But for those of you that have kids, it's like, you know, the chocolate aisle in Tesco's, and they ask you really nicely the first time, don't they, if they can have whatever. And then they ask you a bit more loudly. And then if you're certainly in the stage of life that I seem to be in the last couple of weeks, they'll lie down on the floor and they'll kick and they'll scream in the hope that you will give up and still give them that thing. So they escalate the behavior to see actually at what point will you give in? So I'm just going to give you a more and more extreme request in the hope that that will give me the outcome that I want. The challenge with two things. The extinction burst feels horrible when you see it. So particularly if you're in a context where you're a bit more conflict averse or you're worried about things escalating, whenever you first act, if you suddenly get an escalation of behaviour, you can panic and think, oh God, I've made this worse, and you retract. But the challenge is that if you teach someone, using the kids analogy again, if you teach your kids that if they ask nicely, they don't get, but if they shout and scream, they do get, because you're scared of them lying down on the floor and kicking their feet, what they learn and what they code into their brains is, right, so shouting and screaming gets me what I need. So that becomes the baseline for them in terms of behaviour. So whenever you have an extinction burst happening, when you see it, what you've got to think to yourself is, gosh, right, they're taking me seriously now. They know that no at this level means no. So they're trying the next level. And what I've got to do, or what I've got to support the manager on doing, is riding out this extinction so that no means no. The power and the payoff is removed from that behaviour until they get to the peak, realise that there's no point in carrying that on. And like the knackered child in the sweet aisle, they eventually get up, don't they, and come with you if you just kind of stand there and calmly wait for them to blow themselves out on things. The behavior loses its power, and you're teaching your brain that actually there's no point in going in that particular cave anymore because it hasn't got the berries that it used to have. So there's a real kind of physiological, neurological thing that happens when it comes to this idea of behaviour management and modification, that actually it's very likely that things will get worse before they get better. And while that doesn't feel delightful, it is very helpful because it tells you that someone is starting to see that what's happening is serious and that a change is afoot. And being able to support your manager to notice that and recognise that they've got to ride the arc before it drops off, because literally the graph on this goes up and then drops kind of immediately. It'll peak and then that behaviour just falls away. That really helps then to give you the bravery, I guess, and give them the energy as well to be able to push through the escalation until they get to the point that it drops. Does that make sense to people? Have you ever seen that? Have you ever ridden the wave the whole way through until it drops off? I guess I'm interested in people's experience of riding the extinction burst. You mightn't have known what it was, but I bet you've probably experienced it. Oh gosh, riding the wave at the moment. Not long, not long. I'm sure you'll get your drop off soon. Keep going. You've got this. Well, Dan, if you've got any tips for how I ride the wave with sanity and less chocolate and wine than I'm consuming at the moment, I'll take it. It works with teenagers as well. I don't want to deal with it when they're teenagers, Kathy. Don't tell me that. Okay. Great. Okay, so two things I think just to keep in mind, that, you know, if we want to approach this in a holistic way so that we're resolving the issue, I think both of these kind of concepts are helpful. What's the motivators? What is driving this behavior in the first place? Are we exploring and understanding that? Are we humanizing this person rather than just demonizing their behavior? And also understanding that, riding the element around the extinction burst as well, and being able to consider how you can support yourself and other people able to ride that wave and recognize that that wave is actually positive progress, even though, well, if any of us have stood in that chocolate aisle, we know that it doesn't feel like progress when you're in it, but it's showing people that actually there is some sort of calibration that's happening within the system. Okay. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about, so once we understand that, well, what do we actually do? So what I wanted to do was just kind of share with you this idea of what the critical components of behaviour change really are. So there are lots of complicated models on this. You know, and to be fair, we've got lots of frameworks that we use to understand organisational ecosystems, you know, to be able to quantify some of those needs and payoffs that are going off. But truthfully, whenever we're looking at behaviour change, for us, it kind of boils down to three core things, if I'm completely honest. One is about clarity of understanding and will, clarity of standards. Do people fundamentally understand what is expected of them, and do they have some sort of motivation to sign up for that? So that piece around clarity of standards is absolutely critical. The second piece is around opportunity to act. So does your environment actually allow people to live in those standards, or are your systems and processes, are the reactions of people's colleagues around them, the way that their manager treats them, the way that their team work with them, how they interact with other teams, are they truly giving those people an opportunity to act to those standards, or is that system pointed towards a set of other behaviours that aren't particularly helpful or desirable? And I'd use a prime example of this in kind of broader culture change. Clients will often come to us, particularly the leadership team, saying nobody takes any personal responsibility around here. There's no accountability. There's no this, there's no that. And then we dig into the system and we see actually that they're in a system where they've got caught that the exec team or the SLT have got used to making every single decision. And if a colleague tries to make a decision out of that, it has to get escalated through the governance processes all the way back up. Or somebody gets a bit shirty and says, you should have asked me about that, or critically evaluates it in a way that makes people feel rubbish. Things like the delegated authority for budgeting is rubbish. People can spend like 150 quid and otherwise it's got to get signed off by board, etc. So while there is this desire, conceptual desire within the system for people to be different, the system itself is actually at every touch point saying to people, don't take control, don't take responsibility, keep your head down and follow instructions. So making sure actually that your system is aligned to the particular behaviours that you want, or where someone is grumbling about behaviours, you're supporting them and taking that more systems view around how their behaviour might be influencing what's happening around things, I think is really helpful. So, you know, again, you think about this from a toxic context, a manager who's caught in a really difficult relationship with their team member, they will have absolutely focused all of the blame and effort and energy on what the team member is doing that is unacceptable, but they won't notice the fact that they're leaking frustration or accidental aggression, or perhaps they're avoiding that person because they find the relationship difficult. So their own behaviours are contributing to that dynamic in some way, and it's important to support them to recognise that and understand it. And I think the other piece is about accountability. So again, this is something that we see is a real issue, particularly in toxicity, actually, where we have that intention-based conversation with someone, but we never really follow up with that action-based concrete piece of feedback and accountability around whether they've delivered on those intents. So we just have these kind of crisis meetings over longer periods, and then there's just this kind of passive observation that's happening, and the manager's got a little book of rage somewhere that they're just writing everything that irritates them down, that all gets presented en masse at the end, rather than having those day-to-day conversations about accountability and ideal behaviour moving forward. So together, these kind of three, I guess, principles, thinking about what motivates people, what will happen if we start to change the behaviour, and then what do we really need to put in place if we want to drive consistent and helpful behaviour change, I think help us to be able to get to a place where we're able to really think about how to move things forward. I'm going to take a breath and check if anybody's got any questions about that before we move into, well, what do we actually do about this, Paula? Because I know we need to, conceptual stuff's all well and good, isn't it? It's helpful to understand it, but it's helpful to have a process or a system to work with. Any questions, observations, interested in people's thoughts? Stunned silence, my favourite. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Thanks, Jay. Okay, so what do we actually do? Yeah, absolutely, Joy. Yeah, thank you. Makes absolute sense. It's interesting, isn't it, when you start to look at a whole system perspective, how really unconsciously contradictory the systems that we put people into actually are. And I think sometimes being able to step back and understand that can be really helpful for people. Okay, so let's talk about what we should actually do about this. That's what the fog. I hope we know it's nothing else, because that's the title of the webinar. So I think for me, really what we want to do is be able to, there's kind of a few different stages that I would say we need to work through in this particular context. So doing that first piece of understanding the context is important. So having that deeper dive conversation with everyone involved about what is really going on here. Let's understand what the needs, what the payoffs are, what are the points of contention that are driving through, and humanizing the characters and the people, the players involved, to really understand what's driving things is important. Because I think there is a piece, isn't there, about acknowledgement, understanding, management of any ongoing triggers or pressures that people might be facing, that sometimes they're totally manageable and able to deal with. So I think there's two routes that happen when we do that, understand the context piece. One is it's manageable, it's reasonable, and we can help people work through it and look at it. The other is it's not reasonable, it's not manageable, it's because they've got an expectation of the good old days from 1986, or they're bringing some childhood trauma about never being listened to by their parents into a situation where actually their manager has got greater expertise and experience, and it's okay for them to be the people who are contributing most of the ideas at the moment, and they're struggling with that. If we're in this place, the conversation, there is kind of no point really in terms of managing behaviours until we have the conversation about, look, this is the rules of engagement moving forward, this is what is reasonable, this is what isn't reasonable, and do you want to be here or do you not? You know, that conversation has got to be happening the whole way through this with each of the players. And I think in understanding the context, you can have a much more honest conversation with people about, is this the place for you? And I think you'll notice as I'm talking through a lot of this, particularly when we get on to the next point, I really encourage that you put as much of this as you can back into the manager camp in terms of doing that standard setting, that recontracting around appropriate behaviour, of managing the behaviour through. But I think sometimes in those toxic situations, the place that we can add really real value is that neutrality of stepping in and understanding the conversation and having that real clarity conversation with someone or a team, you know, with an individual or with a team, that's saying, look, this is who we are moving forward. The organisation is moving in this direction to do this sort of thing, and this is the type of environment or type of deal that we can give you, and giving people the support to be able to think that through and think, is this the right place? Is this the right context for me moving forward? We see a huge amount in culture change, I think, particularly where organisations are maybe after a period of real steadiness, moving into growth, or they've had some they've had a steady point, but they're actually moved into an issue of, you know, financial stretch or difficulty, where fundamentally the rules of engagement within how we do work, what we're prioritising, are absolutely changing for people. And some people really struggle with that, and so they kick against it because their need about what is right is never met. But nobody has that really honest conversation that's saying, look, get that you came here whenever you wanted to be absolutely best in class in absolutely everything, and you could do professional development or research 2 days a week or whatever it is, but you know, that isn't where we are anymore, and this is what your role looks like, and this is what the expectations are moving forward. That's a really critical conversation, and I think neutrality in that conversation can be helpful. So through you, or perhaps through the management structure, so a more senior leader who's not directly involved in that toxicity, that understanding that context and helping people think, well, do I actually want to be here, I think is a critical part of that conversation. I think once you've done that, then you're in a much better place to support the manager to really regain control around things. And for me, that's about a really honest two-way reset contracting conversation. So what you're asking the manager to do is set really clear standards about what they expect, what they need from behavioural and a performance point of view, and you're absolutely supporting them to be prepared to quantify that really specifically. and capture that. But the other thing that you want to do, we kind of call it recontracting, is ask the manager to have a human conversation with the person that's saying, what does that mean you need to do? But also, you know, let me talk about what I feel like you need to do, but also let us also talk about what you think you need from me. How do I need to be different in that? How do I need to support you? Or how do I need to respond in a different way to give you the conditions that you need to be able to succeed around that? So supporting those people to have that conversation and future focus, I think is critical. I think a lot of the time what we aim to do is these kind of bloodletting sessions, and I think, you know, we get people in and we try and get them to agree on or process things that they're never going to agree on. And sometimes actually just doing this future focused deal about this is what we need to achieve between us and this is the deal that we're making to move through and try it, that's the thing that builds trust over time. Going over old conversations just brings all the ick up and frustrates people, really. So you've got to make sure that they still want to be here. You can acknowledge some of that frustration, etc. You might even encourage them, if there has been really unacceptable behaviour, to do a short kind of acknowledgement and apology session on that. But as quickly as possible, you want to move into, well, let's just look to the future, shall we? Let's let that go. Let's understand that what has got us to that point isn't acceptable from anyone, and how are we going to move forward and do this in a way that's more acceptable. So in doing that, you're creating the conditions of absolute clarity. You're giving that opportunity because you're doing that piece around what do you need from me to be able to succeed. So you're doing some enablement as well as asking people to take responsibility for themselves. And then you just give them a bit of space to get on with it. And in this place, what I'd be suggesting is that you take a real kind of coaching role around things. You're checking in with the individual, you're checking in with the manager to see how they're kind of getting on with things, and you notice if there's any of the old thoughts or behaviours creeping out, and you support them on staying accountable and focused around that. And then you help that manager stay absolutely clear on managing that behaviour through over time. So in that coaching role and that connection role, you might notice that the manager does need a bit of a redirection. So you're supporting the colleague and having a voice in a situation where maybe they have a bit less power, and it won't be necessarily that they're always totally in the wrong or the total source of toxicity. So making sure that that management of behaviour is you or another leader really watching how the manager is navigating that and supporting them to do that in an effective way, and then giving the manager the space to do that directly with the colleague while giving them that bit of external support can be helpful. Okay. So we use a structure to understand the context that I just wanted to share with you. So this is our culture catalyst scorecard. We use this for all of our kind of cultural analysis, but also for these kind of environmental reviews, contextual reviews, in these sorts of situations where if there is particular behaviours that are coming out that are unhelpful, we'll kind of look through, do data collection to understand each of these factors to see what's going on. And I think in toxic situations, often what you see is that there are issues around clarity of expectation with colleagues. There's that mismatch in psychological contract around things. Often there is a frustration about available resources, or they've got a mismatch in kind of their purpose and their connection to the organisation. They think they need to be doing this, and the organisation needs to be doing something else. A lot of the time they just haven't got what they need or things that they believe they need to do important stuff. And so being able to understand where those needs might be, I think, can be really helpful, both in the capability and the available resource bit. So the needs piece here is quite helpful to look at. And then considering what are they getting from an enablement point of view, what's happening from their management behaviour, what are those managers really doing, how are they behaving, how are they working through, how clear are they being in their operational planning, in the support that they're given on a day-to-day basis, and to what extent are they really using good people management systems and processes to be able to make sure that this stuff isn't flourishing. It can be a nice way to kind of just take a more systematic approach, to understanding what's going on. And also there might be some stuff in the wider ecosystem that's influencing them. You know, we've all had ELT members, we've all had lots of different types of team members, but you know, sometimes people are mirroring the behaviours that they're seeing in other parts of the business that other people can get away with because of their expertise or their seniority, etc. So again, that contextualisation about what super are people sitting in is really critical. Makes sense? Has anybody got any questions or observations about that? Right. So I mentioned already talking about this idea of the kind of the individual or the team contracting. We've just shared with you this idea of kind of how you can flow through the types of questions that you want to encourage through the different conversations, and you can make a choice about what context is the right one for or sorry, what order and who are the right people to do these in. But what I would be saying is you have that, what's the standard, what's the deal really moving forward, what can we give you and what are we expecting back from you moving forward. Having that are you up for it conversation in a really safe and an honest way, and it being totally acceptable for people to say, well, no, I'm not up for that because that isn't what I came in to do around this. And I did that in a role that I had a few years ago where I thought I was coming in to do one thing. I spent a lot of time and probably caused a lot of trouble actually in the organization because I was doing that thing because that's what it thought it wanted, but I hadn't noticed that actually really what it wanted was this thing. And you know, I moved on from that business because I knew I wasn't doing the good that I could do in that context, because actually what it wanted was something that didn't fit within my value set and what my preference would be. So that are you up for it conversation is really critical, and putting people's well-being and their connection to work and general ability to feel proud of what they're doing, I think at the centre of that is critical. And then that allows you to have that more two-way recontracting conversation, which ultimately comes down to what do you need from the business or me to do those things if you're up for it? What are you committing to yourself in terms of what are you going to do? And is there anything that you need more broadly from your team? And that allows you to funnel it into a much more specific kind of action planning conversation. But basically, what we're looking to do is coach the manager through this kind of momentum build. What we're not trying to do with all of this, we've got to take a minute and take a breath and recognise that those conversations are huge. Those behaviours, those beliefs have become really entrenched for people. So you need to give people some space to try out those new behaviours and see that their manager is behaving differently, that their need is being met, that that payoff isn't working. We need to let that test and check process happen for people. So we want to encourage ongoing individual conversations. We want the manager or you or whoever's facilitating the process to be noticing any barriers to them moving forward and supporting them to remove or mitigate the impact of those. We really want to notice any green shoots that there are at all, and we want to celebrate those, and we want to continue. Anytime an old behaviour pops up, we just want to give that a nudge and a reminder to move it down. But that behaviour is, you know, that's not even the takeoff of the change. That's you heading up the runway really in terms of building that momentum. And in doing each of those things, you're building clarity, you're building trust, you're building psychological safety, and you're showing people that those new behaviours are going to pay off, which allows that behaviour change to really take off and move through. Make sense? Okay, so I think the approach is very similar for team recontracting, because sometimes this can come not just from a pairing or an individual, but it can happen for a tribe. And again, I think these conversations work just as well whenever we're working with within a team context. We want to have that conversation about what's the standard, are you up for it? We want to do that piece around what are the commitments that we bring forward, but we just do that slightly differently. We're asking the tribe to come together and acknowledge that they need to do some stuff to move the team forward and consider what they need from each other to be able to move forward, and ask them to make some very specific bids for any other help or input that they might need to do that. And that then allows you to flow nicely into a very specific kind of action planning conversation around things. So really, the focus here is about how do we help people come to terms with, understand the standard, whichever context we're working within. How do we make sure that they have that space, that safe place to really consider, is this for me or is it not? And how do we make it safe for them to say it's not for me, and acceptable to do that? Because often that is the most helpful outcome that you can get in this circumstance. The last thing you want someone to do is be entrenched and stick in, even whenever they and you know that this isn't the right circumstance for you, because that's just heading to performance management nightmare with lots of horrible stuff flowing off it on the way through. So making that really safe, and then being really partnership focused around that action planning and reset, where we're truly considering that we can't just expect someone to flip, but we're going to support them to take the journey towards demonstrate those new behaviours is critical. And obviously making sure the action plan is really specific. So and the accountabilities of each group within that are really specific, so that we can actually manage that through in a structured way. And if we need to, it can start to form the early stages of our performance management process, because we've got the structure around critical accountabilities and priorities in place. So it's given us a head start on that if we need to do that. But the hope is that we can avoid that if required. Okay, so any thoughts, any observations on that? How do you think that works as a process for you? I guess the question that always filters for me on this is manager capability in terms of playing a role in this. You know, what do you think is possible within the context that you've operated within? Is this something that is possible, or is there quite a bit of work to do to get people to this place? What's your thoughts? Thanks, Claire. Yeah, me too. I like it to be specific in terms of the questions and prompts on things.
I think, Paula, there's sometimes a bit of hesitation for some managers to enter into these discussions, but I can absolutely see how having the conversation, nipping it in the bud, could pay off tenfold. I think it's really a really great technique for them. Thank you for sharing.
That's all right. Thanks, Claire. Absolutely. And I see quite a few notes there about managers not wanting to have the conversation. I think you're absolutely right. I think some of it is about retraining managers, but I think some of it's also about ultimate accountability. You know, if there are issues around this coming through, you might be driving accountability through their line managers to make sure that these issues are being managed through. So I think some of it is it's about what levers can we use to encourage people to move past their discomfort. Some of that's training, coaching, support and structures from us, but some of that will also be about accountability through their own line managers, and using the influence that you'll have with their more senior leadership in terms of ensuring that those issues are being managed through. So sometimes some of this is about scorecarding and capturing what different issues are lifting within the teams, and so doing some work with your senior leaders around some of this stuff of what drives toxicity, how it's this two-way process. So you might want to do some kind of general awareness and engagement work at that more senior level, so you've got that additional lever of pressure and influence to help you through it.
Paula, I've got a particular person in mind here, but whenever I approach kind of this person's kind of behaviours, they're very adamant that I need to give them facts and evidence, and then they just pull it to pieces. How would you kind of approach that? Because obviously these kind of scenarios are more about looking to the future. But when someone keeps dragging you into that past, do you kind of just say they're not ready for this type of conversation?
I would focus it on impact and outcomes, because if someone's having a really difficult, if someone's demonstrated a lot of difficult behaviour, often they've become quite isolated. They might be delivering their role to a point, but it's probably not to the level that they could be around things. So I would be not just looking at specific behaviours, but I'd be looking at impact and the outcomes that's having on their role as well. So linking it into that. So I think, honestly, there is a point at which it just becomes about, this is the standard, this is what I'm expecting from you. And if someone isn't hitting that standard, or they're giving you behavioural examples, or you have behavioural examples that are counter, if you've pre-expressed the standard to someone, then you can kind of agree to disagree, but you're the person who's in control of that standard and has the evidence to demonstrate that they're not working to that standard. I think it is difficult, isn't it? Because some of this is micro behaviours, and so it can feel quite fluffy. But if you've been really clear about, these are 5 things that I don't want to see again in the future, and then you can list where you've seen those things, they may agree with you or not, but it kind of doesn't matter, does it? Because you're in control of the evidence capture around that.
Okay, no, that's lovely. Thank you.
I think the truth is, with some people, you will never get to agreement in these conversations. And at that point, it just becomes about performance management, doesn't it? You know, if someone is showing absolutely no interest or intent around shifting their behaviour, responding to feedback, etc., that in itself is a indicator of a behaviour that's probably counter to the standards that you're setting for people in your competency frameworks or in your role profiles, etc. So, some of this stuff you can pull together. That behaviour in itself, Suzanne, is one that I would kind of be adding to the evidence, really, of why this person isn't delivering what they need to in their role.
Yeah, no, that's really, really useful. Thank you.
The only other thing I would say, so I don't know, we haven't talked about this specific scenario, but the other question I'd be asking myself is, am I the right person to give the feedback on this? Because I think often we as HR get pulled in and expected to own all of that feedback, and because we're not in connection with that person on a day-by-day basis, it's easier for them to pull it apart because we're bringing other people's reports and stories together. The line manager has got to be having these conversations, and you can support them to do that, but they will have much stronger pull and evidence often in that context.
Yeah. You've read my mind. That's exactly what happened.
Fair enough. Thank you. Any other thoughts or observations from anyone, or any questions? Okay, so the last thing that I want to say, because we have the elephant in the room, is what I'm talking about there. I would say honestly that around, I haven't got a percentage on it, but I'm going to say like 80-90% of the time, whenever we have got involved in work like this, and we only really do it on that kind of investigative, coping, supporting side of things. But whenever we do dig into this sort of thing, generally you find that a large proportion of the time, I've forced a percentage, but I'm uncomfortable with that because I haven't got any evidence to give you on it. But the vast majority of time, certainly in my experience, is that there is some sort of need or payoff that you can reset that allows you to pull people round. But honestly, sometimes it gets so far that people can't even bear to be in the room with each other. And not that long ago, a really great client of ours got in touch and said, I've got 2 people in the team, blah blah blah. Like, right, well, what's going on here? Tell me what the context is. Well, this one's now living with this one's husband. Just like, right, well, there is literally nothing that I can do to change the fact that that person is now living with that person's husband. No matter how many standards we set or the like, that those people are bringing that emotion into are bringing an emotion and a level of displeasure into a conversation that we're probably not going to be able to change. And I think in some situations you're not going to be able to, the instinct might be to use something like mediation or do some team building just to try and get those people to get on. But honestly, all you can do in that situation is acknowledge that that's a really tough context, or some really horrible stuff has come before, and that actually there is an expectation for people to manage their emotions within the workplace and not allow that to interfere. So that for that sort of thing, we can explore the context, we can try and resolve the things that we can, but where there is stuff is truly unresolvable because of whatever, somebody knocked somebody's husband, or somebody said something truly terrible whenever somebody was in a really vulnerable part of their life that they're never going to let go of, it's all right to acknowledge that thing feels really tough to that person, but then set the standard that says that cannot interfere with work. And if it does interfere with work, then we're going to have a conversation about whether this is the right place for you to work. So there is a line to this that I think often our instinct when it comes to toxicity is we want to create sunshine and roses, but actually all we truly need from people is functionality in some circumstances. So it's okay to just demand that functionality from people, and it's okay to support them, to put some supporting coping mechanisms in place to make sure that they're getting that, whether they've got a venting system or their manager is a safe place to talk about some of those things in a reasonable way to keep them functional. That's okay. But I think truthfully, our job isn't to make everybody best friends at work. Our job is about supporting people. Our job in HR is about capability enablement and talent activation. That's what our job is, to support the organisation, to create the conditions for people to be the best they can be. And sometimes that's just about saying, so this is a rubbish situation. How do I help you be the best that you can be? This is what I'm expecting from you. And how do I help you be the best that you can be within that circumstance? So it's just a little bit of a reminder that we cannot be the keeper of everybody else's emotions and experiences. And it's totally all right to sometimes just draw the line. And if it's not a healthy place for people to be because of whatever's gone before, makes it really difficult for them not to be emotionally triggered, then we've got to support them to either manage those emotions or move on to another environment. Make sense? So, yeah. Absolutely, Chloe. I was just about to say, I think that often we're attracted into this profession because we are, because we care and we want people to have positive and nice experiences. So we've got this desire to resolve things, and then we can drive ourselves potty. But the goal has always, in these circumstances, got to be functional operation, people being competent and effective. If they are choosing to hold on to something that is a toxic emotion, that is their choice. That is not our choice. We cannot change that. It's up to them to manage their own emotional landscape around that. So, any questions, comments, or cries for help at this stage that we need to pick up on? Or has that given you a healthy dose of inspiration for the revolution on toxic teams? What's your thoughts? Thanks, Vicky. Great. Oh, good news. Good news. I'm glad it's been a good session. Thanks, everybody.